In our next session, we are going to invite one of the co-founder of Domino Data Lab, Matthew Granade, who is also a current managing director of Point72, to share more about his view on building a model-driven business. And from the team, there's a side note. So today is also actually Matthew's birthday. So thank you so much for joining us on your birthday.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks, Morgan, for the introduction. Today there's going to be a lot of different speakers talking about the importance of artificial intelligence and a lot of the advances that have been made, how hardware is changing things, how to apply this to healthcare and cars and all sorts of other interesting industries. The thing I want to talk a little bit about, though, the thing the organizers have asked me to talk about is how to think about using these advances and applying them to creating businesses. So how do you build a company given all that's changing with data and all that's changing with artificial intelligence? And as this group well knows, there's a ton that's changing. Obviously, data volumes are exploding, compute power is cheaper than ever, the algorithms are faster and better than ever. So the question I want to focus on is how do you leverage all of this to build a business? And my answer, in short, is you build a model-driven business. That's basically what I want to focus on. As Morgan said, I come at this from a few different angles. In 2013, I co-founded Domino Data Labs with some other colleagues from Bridgewater Associates. And what we do at Domino is we provide a model management platform for analytically advanced companies. And so we've really been trying to push companies to be more and more model driven now for the last 5 or 6 years. And I also run Point72 Ventures, which is a venture firm where we do a bunch of different things. But one of the things we really focus on is AI focused companies or model driven companies as an investment thesis. So, in terms of my agenda, I want to start by sort of defining what I mean by a model-driven business and giving some examples so that it's clear what I'm talking about. Then I want to lay out, basically the criterion for industries that are ripe for this kind of disruption and how you'd pick a situation where you could build a model-driven business, and then talk quickly about some of the steps, kind of the 4 or 5 key steps to building a model-driven business. And so, like I said, it's kind of almost like a how-to guide for building this type of company. So with that, I'll get started. The advances in analytical techniques have spawned, in my view, essentially a new business model. So in addition to being a lot of advances in science and engineering, this new business model of being model-driven is also a new advancement. And so for a long time, we've talked about things being data-driven. We've talked about how software's changed businesses. But I really think that there's literally a new business model at hand, and that's probably one of the most interesting things that's changed. So let me just quickly define kind of what I mean by a model, and though I don't think it'll probably be a surprise to this crowd, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think of as a model-driven business. So I think of a model as a decision framework. So it's basically, you have data coming in, you have logic, and you have some sort of prediction coming out. And that decision framework can help you in lots of different ways. Hedge funds were sort of one of the places where this, quant hedge funds in particular, one of the places where this was first pioneered. And sort of this idea, you take market data, you apply logic. And when we founded Domino, that was kind of one of our key thoughts. And one of our was basically that this idea that we had applied at Bridgewater to market data could be applied in a lot of different business settings. The power of that is a couple of things. One is that a model leads you to action. It tells you probabilistically what you should do. And then also, very importantly, it can learn and evolve. Given that learning and given that evolution, it basically has tremendous power to continue to get better. And one of the things we often sort of thought about at Bridgewater was how much better our models were getting year after year. After a decade or 2 decades of sort of operating that way, you have a tremendous foundation on which to build. So if you think about what a model-driven business then is, it's one that puts that power of a model, kind of in the center of its business processes, either for creating new revenue or for creating cost efficiencies of some variety. And it requires a mechanism for collecting data. It then requires a way to process that data via a model, and then it requires a mechanism for sort of feeding that prediction back either to some sort of decision maker or to a consumer in a way that they can use it. To make this concrete, I think one of the best examples of a model-driven business is Netflix. It's a $130 billion company, and that's. I think some people would sort of say, well, that's because it's got all this content. Well, my view of it is actually that it has a really powerful way of making you consume the content. And that really powerful way is its recommendation engine or its recommendation model. And if you think about where that model comes from, it starts from the moment you sign up. The company takes your credit card information, your address, and is able to marry that up with other databases and other sources and start to build a picture of you. And then what it can do is it can watch what shows you watch quickly, what shows you don't watch, what shows you sort of stop but never finish. And from there, it's able to build better and better recommendations of what content you as an individual would want to consume. The kind of like staggering thing in my mind is that 80% of the content consumed on the Netflix platform is due to the recommendation engine. So 20% is you sort of saying, here's something I want to go watch. 80% is the recommendation engine basically getting you to consume content that it thinks you want to watch. You just think you're in charge of your preferences. It turns out you're not really in charge of your preferences. So as you use that platform more, of course, it gets better and better. It gets better both for you, and it also gets better for everybody else because it's constantly learning. It's taking in more data and more information, and it's improving what it's doing as a result of that. And that's really, kind of the power, in my view, of a model-driven business. It's the flywheel. Companies use data to build a model. That model creates a good product. That product attracts more customers. Those more customers bring more data. That better data makes a better product, which attracts more customers, and you sort of go in that loop, and it just gets more and more powerful. And if we had more time, you could use sort of that same framework to explain, I think, a lot of other really large businesses today. Tencent, Amazon, Spotify, a bunch of others. And it's really kind of a key framework, I think, to some of the most successful companies in the world at the moment. But I think if you were to criticize this framework, you'd say, well, all the examples you just used are of consumer-facing companies, consumer tech companies. Does this really apply more broadly? And the thing I would say that we're seeing in our venture firm, Point72 Ventures, is that it is widely applicable to a whole range of industries, and that we're really seeing an explosion in all sorts of places of this same sort of model-driven thinking. We're seeing it applied to call centers, managed security services, printed circuit boards, clinical trials, construction, loan processing, debt collection, and the list just goes on and on and on. I obviously won't take time to kind of give you all those examples, but I did think I would sort of take one sort of more from the startup side of things and use it to sort of elucidate the point from a different angle, and that is clinical trials. And the company's called Deep Six. When a pharma company invents a new drug, the critical step they have to then get through is they have to get it qualified to be able to pass it out to humans. And to do that, you have to go through a clinical trial. And you want that to go as quickly as possible because patent protection starts from when the drug's invented, not from when it's approved for use. And you also want to get the drug in the hands of people as soon as possible. So that's the first step for doing a clinical trial is you have to recruit patients. And today, that's a massively antiquated process. Basically, what pharma companies do is they send researchers into medical systems and in hospitals, and they have them kind of go through files and try to find patients that would be a good match. And it takes generally like 9 to 12 months, and 30% of clinical trials don't even sort of launch. They fail before they even start because they can't recruit enough patients. And so, what's interesting is, how do you take a model-driven approach to that? And that's basically what Deep Six has done. First, they built a data asset. They work with 5 of the 10 largest medical systems in America, and they have electronic access to all of their records. And then second, they've built 2 or 3 different models to be able to solve the clinical trial process via that approach. So the first model is taking all that data and making sense out of it. So when you look at a patient, and you look at their electronic health record, does that patient have diabetes or not? What is their family history? Have they had a certain heart episode? What are their genetic markers? What are their behaviors, et cetera? And that's actually a fairly difficult problem, as you can imagine, kind of an unstructured healthcare record. And then the second model they've built is they've been able to sort of say, okay, given what a pharmaceutical company wants, what's the probability that a certain person is a match? And that's basically then sort of taking in, well, I want someone has diabetes but's never had a heart event, or has diabetes and doesn't have high blood pressure, and scoring that probabilistically. And then they close the feedback loop because that information goes to the doctors, and the doctors sort of say, well, that was a good call or that was a bad call, and then they end up sort of recruiting the patients. And what they've done is they've taken what's generally been a 12-month process down to about 6 weeks, which represents tremendous revenue for pharma companies. It also represents revenue for the medical systems because they're getting these patients in clinical trials, and then it represents better, fast drugs delivered faster to patients. So a really kind of innovative approach to a problem that's quite different than the Netflix example that I gave earlier. So let's say that you are now swayed in the 5 minutes that I've spent explaining model-driven businesses by the idea of a model-driven business. And you're kind of asking, well, if you were to build one, how would you do it? What would you think about? And in my mind, there's sort of 2 big criterion for an industry that's ripe for model-driven disruption. One is that a prediction has to play a critical role in a business process. And then the other is that the prediction has to be able to be handled by the existing AI technologies. So let me talk briefly about both those, and then I'll offer a little bit of a cut-through way that we sometimes think about this problem. So if you think about the first one, basically the foundation condition for creating a model-driven business is that some core business process requires prediction. And I could give you a whole bunch of examples, but just to give you a few, with Netflix, that prediction is what you want to watch on television. With Amazon, there's a bunch of them, but one of them is, what are you going to buy today that you want delivered tomorrow, so that they can decide how to set up their supply chain. Obviously with Deep Six, it's which patients are a good fit for a specific clinical trial. But imagine a recycling center. In the case of a recycling center, the prediction might be, is that steel or is that aluminum? And what should the robotic arm do with it after it picks it up? In the case of a printed circuit board manufacturer, the prediction might be, what part does that engineer really want, and is it compatible with all the other parts on the board? In the case of debt collection, it might be you have someone who makes calls to collect debt. Who's the right person in the list of people to call first? Like who do you have the highest probability of getting paid from? And the list goes on and on. But in each case, some sort of prediction forms the foundation of the business, and that then sort of sets you up for a model-driven approach. The second big criterion is that AI has to be able to handle the prediction in question. And I'll just give a couple of thoughts on that. This room is filled with experts in that field, so I'm not going to lecture on AI for sure. But I think what I would say is that AI, it's more powerful than ever, and there's a lot of situations where a lot of these tools can be applied. But on the other hand, I think the thing I would point out is that whatever you build actually has to work. And I'm kind of reminded of this constantly on the venture side of what I do, because we see lots of great ideas where it's really, really hard for the product to actually deliver functionality that the company wants. And that's why we always ask for demos. And sometimes those demos are painful, and sometimes they're quite impressive. But if you think about kind of what's behind that, the painfulness of some of those demos, it's actually sort of, I think, stems from something that Kai-Fu Lee talks a lot about, which is it takes 4 different conditions for AI to really work. One is you need a massive amount of relevant data, you need a strong algorithm, you need a narrow domain, and you need a concrete goal. And if you don't have sort of all those preconditions met, it's going to be really hard for AI to solve the problem. So, the point I would just make is that, while AI is very powerful, I think to really build a model-driven business, you have to be able to, the existing techniques, the existing technologies have to be able to solve a real problem at hand. The quick sort of aside here that I would just add about in terms of how we think about building model-driven businesses is, and how we look for opportunities to do this, is where essentially humans don't seem to be a particularly good fit for the work that needs to be done. And so, often an indicator of that is turnover. So we, for instance, believe that call centers are a great opportunity to apply AI. The turnover rate in a call center, in most call centers, is somewhere around 20% per month. Which is a sort of staggering statistic. If you think about the recycling facilities I was talking about, the injury rate in a recycling facility, something like 3 to 5% of workers will get injured in any year. And something like 1% will get a hypodermic needle prick. And so these are just staggering statistics that just basically like the human is not quite cut out for the work that needs to be done. And that's a little bit of a trick we use sometimes to think about where model-driven disruption might make a lot of sense. So just to wrap up, in terms of sort of the last section here, talking a little bit about the steps for building a model-driven business, I thought I would sort of use an example, and that would be language translation services. So, so again, let's say you've decided you want to build a model-driven business, and you've picked an industry. In this case, language translation services actually, I think, meet both the criterion I talked about earlier pretty well. That's a $20 billion industry. Turns out people all over the place need things translated all the time. Newspapers need things translated for other readers. Google has to translate their terms of service into dozens and dozens of languages. Even something simple like help desk tickets, right? If you're Apple, you're getting help desk tickets and help desk requests from all over the world. And again, somebody has to be able to translate that. So if you were thinking about how to build a model-driven business in that space, I'd suggest these are kind of the 4 key steps. You have to build the data asset, you have to train your algo, you have to integrate those results into the business, and you have to close the feedback loop. I won't spend a ton of time on all these, but just to kind of quickly make a few points about each one. The first one's pretty critical in terms of building your data asset. In the case of language translation, you're going to need tens of thousands of texts in one language and sort of what the resulting thing was in another language. And it's often a really hard problem to solve in terms of data asset because, and we call it the cold start problem, because who's going to give you data unless you have something to offer them? And how do you offer them something without the data? And that's why we sort of call it the cold start problem. And we've seen a couple of different solutions to it. I mean, one is that you can sometimes find like a toehold product that gets you access to the data. And then the other thing that's, we think, proving increasingly interesting is M&A type activity, where you're acquiring data or acquiring companies to acquire their data so you can train your models. But that's often hard for a startup to pull off. Once you then have the data, you also want to make sure that it's well structured and well engineered for the sort of the task that you have at hand. And that really often requires sort of taking control of the workflow process that's in question. So if you think about the translation example that I was using, you want to have exactly what request came through and all the metadata related to it in terms of timing and who the person was and what they wanted, et cetera. And then you also want to know what the translator ultimately suggested and also how well it was received. And you want to have all 3 of those things. And a lot of times you find that businesses aren't collecting all that data as well as they should. The second thing you have to do is you have to train your algorithm. And again, given the expertise of this audience, I won't dwell on that point. I guess I would sort of say a couple of things though. I mean, one is that a lot of this is the recruiting challenge of building an AI business, and that there's sort of nothing more important to spend money on than getting the right people in who can build the right algorithm and have the right world-class team. The second thing I would say, though, is that you also don't have to rely on the algorithm to be the sole answer. And some of the most innovative businesses we see are people that are building solutions and then sort of putting a human in the loop somehow to basically interpret what the machine is saying in a way that then a customer will find acceptable. So again, if you think about that translation example, you could have an algorithm that delivers it directly to someone, or you could have an algorithm that delivers it to a translator who then corrects it and sort of makes it better, and then that is then delivered to someone. And we often find, whether it be the call center example or various other examples I've given, that putting that human in the loop is extremely powerful, both for sort of sanding off the rough edges of the algorithm's answer, and then also creating an opportunity for the algorithm to learn, so that you sort of see the different mistakes that are made, and you can make them better. And then the next step is you have to then integrate that into your business. In the case of Netflix, that's via an app or a website where the recommendations delivered to you. In the case of the call center, it means building software that recommends the most likely solution to a customer problem. In the language translation example, like I said, it means building something that a translator can use, where the algorithm's making recommendations and they can quickly decide what to accept and what not to accept. And then the final step is this point around learning, which again, I think it's really the power of the model-driven business, which is the ability to sort of see what worked and what didn't work, and be able to learn from it. And so, I think it's critical to close the feedback loop. And if you're not closing the feedback loop, you're not really sort of taking advantage of the full power of that type of business. So, just to wrap up, I believe that model-driven businesses are basically the most powerful businesses in the world today and really in the world tomorrow as well. And they represent tremendous opportunities for people who want to work with AI in a business setting. And so I'd encourage everybody today to think about what industry might be ripe for that kind of disruption and what they might build. And I'm happy to talk about any of those ideas because it's what I love to do. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.